Marry me. Think of it as a contract. In my world, love was a liability. Trust, a currency too expensive to spend. Millionaire married his assistant to protect his fortune, but her goodbye broke him. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, please subscribe, tap the bell, and tell me where you're watching from. Now, let us return to our main character. Rain traced silver lines across the tall windows of Hale Tower. Inside, under the glow of cold city light, Ethan Hale stood behind his desk, a man built entirely of control. His assistant, Sophie Tran, waited near the door, clutching a folder to her chest. The silence between them felt heavier than the storm outside. Ethan's tone was calm, precise. My board is demanding that I get married before the next quarter. It is a condition in my late father's will. He looked up, eyes steady, unreadable. I do not believe in love, but I believe in protection. So marry me, for 6 months. Think of it as a contract. Sophie blinked, unsure she had heard him right. You are joking. I never joke about business, Ethan replied. His voice was low, clipped, almost mechanical. You are the only person I can trust with discretion. You know every password, every calendar detail, every secret. You have kept my company intact when most people would have sold me out. Sophie swallowed. Why me? He hesitated for just a breath. Because you are not interested in my money. That makes you safe. Her heart pounded. She had worked for him for 3 years, watched him crush mergers and silence boardrooms. But this was different. This was personal. You realize how absurd this sounds, right? Completely. He opened a slim folder, sliding a single-page document toward her. There are clear terms. No intimacy. No interference in company affairs. 5 public events together. You will receive financial compensation and a new position after the contract expires. Sophie stared at the paper, the ink still wet. You really wrote this? I do not make impulsive decisions, Ethan said. I protect what I have built. Marriage, in this case, is a firewall. She almost laughed, a shaky, nervous sound. And what happens when people start asking why I said yes? He met her eyes, steady and cold. Tell them it was a promotion. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of rain filled the office, the city lights flickered against the glass. Sophie's fingers brushed the edge of the contract. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished desk, a woman who had nothing left to lose, and a man who had everything to protect. Finally, she said softly, You do not have to love me, Mr. Hale. Just promise me one thing. What is that? Be kind. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Kindness I can manage. She picked up the pen. The signature came slow, deliberate, like sealing a fate she did not yet understand. When she was gone, Ethan stood alone, staring at the papers she left behind. Outside, thunder rolled through the skyline, echoing the question he refused to ask himself. Why her? He told himself it was only strategy, a line of defense. But deep down, something fragile stirred, a feeling he had buried long before he learned how to win. Under the gray morning sky, New York glistened after a night of rain. The glass walls of Hale Tower caught the first light, scattering gold across Ethan Hale's office. He was already there, suit immaculate, tie sharp, eyes fixed on a spreadsheet that no longer mattered. His world was numbers, contracts, and control. But today, something felt different. It had been 3 days since Sophie signed the contract. 3 days of silence that echoed louder than any board meeting. The papers lay on his desk, her signature crisp, decisive. She had not asked for more money, not even clarification, just that one strange condition. Be kind. Ethan pushed away from the desk, walking to the window. Below, the city was waking horns, footsteps, a siren far off. He used to find comfort in its rhythm, but now it only reminded him how detached he had become. For years, love was noise he refused to hear. He had built walls so high, even sincerity could not climb them. At precisely 8, the elevator chimed. Sophie stepped out, her hair still damp from the drizzle, wearing a pale gray coat that did not belong in this world of steel and marble. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said, voice calm, professional. He turned, nodding once. You are early. Contract says I report at 8. I intend to keep that part clear. Her tone was polite but distant, and for the first time in years, someone spoke to him without fear. She handed him a planner, perfectly organized, color-coded by priority. Her efficiency should have impressed him, but what caught him off guard was the calmness in her eyes. He studied her for a second longer than necessary. You read the full terms again? Yes, she said, and I intend to honor them. I will accompany you to all 5 public events and maintain discretion. After that, I will leave quietly. Something in her last word hit deeper than it should. He nodded. Understood. We have a press dinner tonight. 7 o'clock. Dress accordingly. I will handle it, she replied. May I go over the week's itinerary? As she spoke, he caught faint traces of lavender soap, simple, clean, not expensive. For a man who measured everything in cost, that scent felt disarming. Hours passed. They worked side by side in silence that was oddly comfortable. When the storm outside began again, thunder rolling through the skyline, Ethan glanced up to find her closing the blinds. You do not like the rain? He asked. She smiled faintly. It ruins the view, but it makes the world honest. Nothing looks perfect in the rain. That line lingered. Later, in the reflection of the window, he saw her behind him, sorting contracts, pen-tapping lightly to a tune only she could hear. She did not seem impressed by the skyline or the expensive office. She belonged to reality, not illusion. And that, somehow, unsettled him. By evening, they were in the back seat of his black sedan heading to the press dinner. The city lights moved like rivers across the tinted glass. Sophie adjusted her bracelet, quiet, poised. Ethan's phone buzzed his PR manager, reminding him to appear affectionate. He exhaled sharply. You may need to hold my hand for the cameras. She turned to him, half amused. I will try not to make it look forced. He gave a thin smile. You will fit into this world faster than you think. She met his gaze. Maybe, but I do not intend to stay in it. The driver slowed at the hotel entrance. Flash bulbs popped as soon as the doors opened. Ethan stepped out first, expression neutral. Sophie followed, her hand sliding into his, as photographers shouted their names. To the watching world, they looked perfect, a powerful man and his composed wife. But inside, his chest tightened with a feeling he could not define. She was supposed to be an accessory to protect his fortune. Instead, she was making him remember he still had a heart. That night, after the dinner, he found himself replaying her words. Nothing looks perfect in the rain. He poured a drink he did not finish, staring out the window again. The rain fell harder. Somewhere in the city below, she was probably home, removing the borrowed jewelry, returning to her small apartment, and thinking nothing more of him. But Ethan Hale, the man who once thought love was a liability, could not stop thinking about a woman who asked for nothing except kindness. The next morning began like any other, precise and controlled. Ethan Hale thrived on routine, and yet, ever since Sophie Tran had stepped into his carefully structured world, the rhythm had started to shift in ways he could not explain. When he arrived at the office, she was already there, standing by the conference table, reviewing documents for the upcoming charity gala. Her sleeves were rolled up, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked focused, almost serene. Ethan paused at the door longer than he should have. Good morning, she said without looking up. He adjusted his tie. You are early again. Habit, she replied. I find it easier to prepare when the city is quiet. He nodded, pretending not to notice the small cup of coffee waiting on his desk. Black, no sugar, just the way he liked it. She must have noticed after the dinner last night. The gesture was simple, but it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They spent the morning reviewing schedules, rehearsing answers for the media, and aligning the narrative for their upcoming appearance as a married couple. Sophie's efficiency impressed him, but it was her composure that caught his attention. She moved through chaos with grace, never raising her voice, never losing focus. Around noon, she looked up from the tablet and asked, Mr. Hale, have you ever done something you did not believe in, just to keep people from falling apart? Ethan frowned. You are referring to the contract? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Maybe, Or maybe I am just trying to understand the kind of man who turns love into a business transaction. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Love makes people reckless. I do not have that luxury. Sophie studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to push further. Then she simply said, "It must be lonely, being that careful." Her words stayed with him the entire afternoon. By evening, as they walked through the marble lobby toward the car, Ethan found himself glancing at her reflection in the glass doors. For the first time, the sight felt unfamiliar, like seeing a person he wanted to understand, not control. The charity gala was held at the Astoria Grand, an ocean of chandeliers and designer gowns. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the red carpet, their hands brushing lightly. She smiled for the reporters, poised and effortless, while he maintained the image of a man who had everything under control. But inside, Ethan felt the facade begin to crack. The noise, the lights, the shallow conversations, all of it felt meaningless compared to the quiet sincerity in Sophie's eyes. At their table, an investor's wife leaned across with a smirk. "Mrs. Hale, you must be thrilled. Not every assistant ends up marrying her boss." The words were dipped in sugar but poisoned at the core. Ethan's grip on his glass tightened, but before he could speak, Sophie laughed softly. "You are right. I am very fortunate. Most men marry for status. Mine married for organization." The table erupted in polite laughter. The tension broke, and the woman leaned back, disarmed. Ethan turned to Sophie, surprise flickering behind his calm exterior. She had just saved him from humiliation and done it with humor. As the music swelled, he leaned closer. "You handled that well. I learned from the best," she said, eyes glinting with quiet defiance. Later, during a pause between speeches, Sophie excused herself to step outside. Ethan followed a few minutes later, drawn by something he could not name. She stood by the balcony, overlooking the city lights, arms folded against the breeze. Her voice was soft. "You know, when I agreed to this arrangement, I thought it would be simple. A few months of pretending, and then I would go back to my old life. But I did not expect you to feel so human." He took a slow breath. "Is that an insult or a compliment?" "A truth," she said, turning toward him. "You hide it well, but you are not as cold as you pretend to be." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world fell silent. The laughter from the ballroom faded into the distance. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Careful, Sophie. You are starting to sound like you care." She smiled sadly. "Maybe I do, but you are the one who said love is a liability." Before he could respond, the sound of applause burst from inside, pulling them back to reality. Sophie looked away first. "We should go. People will notice." Ethan nodded, but as he followed her back into the light, one thought echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, he wanted to be wrong about love. The next week unfolded in a blur of scheduled appearances, interviews, and meetings that left little room for silence. Ethan Hale was used to efficiency, but lately, even his own order felt disrupted. Sophie Tran had become part of the rhythm, her voice in the boardroom, her calm in the storm, her quiet presence that somehow softened the edges of his life. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the blinds, she entered his office holding a stack of invitations. "3 events this week," she said. "A board dinner, a magazine shoot, and a charity auction for the Hale Foundation." Ethan barely looked up from his laptop. "Cancel the magazine shoot." "Already done," she replied smoothly. "You dislike cameras. I remember." He raised an eyebrow. "You remember everything, do you not?" "Only what matters," she said with a faint smile. Her tone disarmed him again. He had spent years surrounded by people who memorized his preferences for advantage, not out of attention. But Sophie did it without calculation, and that difference unnerved him more than he would admit. That evening, they attended the foundation auction together. The ballroom glowed gold, and their photographs lined the press wall as Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Sophie moved through the crowd like she belonged there, elegant, poised, untouched by the shallow glances of high society. Ethan watched from across the room as she spoke with a senator's wife, her laughter light, her posture unforced. When he joined her, she turned slightly toward him, her hand brushing his arm in an unplanned, natural gesture. Cameras clicked instantly, freezing the moment forever. "Smile," she whispered under her breath. "They are watching." He did, for once not because the public demanded it, but because she was there. Later that night, after the last glass was emptied and the applause faded, they rode the elevator in silence. The hum of the city below felt distant. Sophie leaned against the mirrored wall, her voice calm. "For someone who hates events, you handled tonight well. Do not sound so surprised," he said. She looked at him, her expression softening. "I am not. I think you are better at pretending than you realize." The words struck something deep inside him. The elevator doors opened to his penthouse, and without thinking, he said, "Come in, we should debrief." She hesitated but followed him inside. The suite was sleek and modern, everything polished, nothing personal. Sophie walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. "Beautiful," she murmured. But lonely. Ethan stood a few feet behind her. Lonely is safer. Nothing gets broken when no one is close enough to touch it. She turned to face him. "Maybe. But nothing grows either." He could not find a reply. The air between them felt charged, fragile. Sophie glanced down at her bracelet, the same one she had worn since the first day. She slid it off and placed it gently on the coffee table. "You said you wanted professionalism, Mr. Hale. Consider this a reminder." He frowned. "A reminder of what?" "That even in a contract, people can feel things they should not." The silence stretched. She gathered her purse and started toward the door, but he spoke before she could leave. "Sophie." She stopped. "Why did you say yes that night?" She turned, meeting his eyes. "Because you looked like someone who needed to be saved, even if you did not believe it." Her words hung in the air, and before he could respond, she walked out, the elevator doors closing behind her. Ethan stood still, staring at the bracelet on the table. The silver caught the light, faint but persistent like her. The next morning he found it beside his coffee cup, neatly placed as if she had never left. Yet her absence filled every corner of his apartment. He sat down, opened his laptop, and saw a notification. Press photo of Mr. and Mrs. Hale trending at Hashone. The image showed them laughing, her hand on his arm, his gaze fixed entirely on her. For a man who had built his empire on control, the realization was devastating. He was losing it, not to greed or power, but to the one thing he had sworn off long ago. Love was never part of the contract, but it was already rewriting the fine print. By the time winter arrived, Ethan Hale's life no longer moved with the same mechanical precision it once did. The merger that had once consumed his days now felt secondary. What unsettled him most was how easily Sophie Tran had become essential, her quiet competence, her steady presence, her ability to speak truth when others only echoed what he wanted to hear. He told himself it was convenience. He told himself it was professionalism. But when he began scheduling meetings later just to prolong her hours, he knew he was lying to himself. One gray afternoon, Sophie entered his office holding a thin folder. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "I have been asked to review tomorrow's gala agenda. There is a speech segment under your name." Ethan glanced up from his computer. "Yes, a statement about the new Hale Foundation Scholarship Fund." She hesitated. "Would you like me to prepare your remarks?" "I would prefer you deliver them," he said. Her brows lifted slightly. "Me? You are the face the public trusts. I am only the brand." Sophie looked down at the folder. "You are giving away millions in student grants. People trust that." He leaned back, studying her. "Money is not what inspires people. Integrity does, and you have that." She did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Sometimes, Mr. Hale, I do not understand you." "Neither do I," he said quietly. The next evening, the gala shimmered with crystal lights and polished marble. Photographers lined the red carpet, flashes cutting through the cold night. Sophie wore a simple black gown, elegant but modest. Ethan noticed how she carried herself not like a guest, not like an ornament, but like someone who belonged there by merit, not by name. During dinner, one of the board members leaned close to Ethan. "She is quite the asset, Hale. Smart move. Marrying her. Public loves a good underdog story. Ethan's jaw tightened. She is not a move. She is a person. The man laughed awkwardly and turned away, leaving Ethan staring at his untouched glass. When the host called Sophie to the stage, she froze for a brief second, then glanced toward Ethan. He gave a small nod. She exhaled and stepped forward, her voice steady as she began to speak. She talked about opportunity, about how the foundation was built to give hope to people who could not afford to dream. She mentioned no names, no self-congratulation, only conviction. When she finished, the room rose in applause. Ethan's chest tightened. Pride was not something he felt often, but in that moment, he felt it pure and unguarded. After the speeches, Sophie moved through the crowd gracefully, accepting compliments with humble smiles. When she returned to their table, Ethan stood. "You were extraordinary," he said. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but thank you." As they turned toward the exit, flashes erupted again, cameras catching every movement. One photographer shouted, "Mr. Hale, how does it feel being married to your assistant?" Ethan ignored him, but Sophie's steps faltered. The question cut deeper than she expected. That night, back in the car, silence filled the space between them. The city lights flickered across the windows as she looked out, avoiding his gaze. "Sophie," he said finally, "you knew what this would be." "Yes," she whispered, "but I did not know what it would feel like." When the car stopped at her apartment, she reached for the door handle but paused. "You once said love was a liability. Maybe you were right. But loneliness is an even greater cost." He wanted to speak, to say something that would stop her from leaving, but nothing came out. She stepped out into the cold and walked away. Ethan sat still, watching her disappear into the streetlight. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Not because of a lost deal or a threat to his empire, but because the woman he had married to protect his fortune had somehow become the only thing he could not control. He closed his eyes, and the words she had spoken echoed in his mind. Loneliness is an even greater cost. That night, he realized the truth he had been avoiding all along. The contract may have built his protection, but she had become his reason to feel alive. The following week, New York was buried under steady rain. The sound of it against the glass walls of Hale Tower echoed like a quiet reminder of everything Ethan Hale had tried to ignore. Sophie Tran had kept her distance since the gala, speaking only when necessary, always polite but colder now. He could not blame her. Every word she had said that night was true, and he hated that he had no defense. He sat behind his desk long after everyone had gone, staring at the contract that had started it all. The ink was still sharp, her signature graceful and final. "No love, no attachment." He whispered the words aloud as if saying them would make them real again, but they no longer were. The door opened softly. "You are still here," Sophie said, her voice calm, unreadable. Ethan looked up. "I could ask you the same." She crossed the room, setting a file on his desk. "Quarterly reports. You will need to approve them before the audit," he nodded. But his eyes lingered on her face. "You could have sent them by email." "I could have," she replied. "But I thought this deserved a proper goodbye." The word hit him harder than he expected. "Goodbye? Coling Lee?" Sophie took a breath. "My part of the contract ends next week. You will have fulfilled the terms, and I plan to leave the company." Ethan stood slowly. "Leave the company?" "Yes. It was always meant to be temporary. You needed protection, and I needed stability. We both got what we wanted." He took a step closer, his tone quiet but tense. "That is not what I want anymore." She shook her head gently. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. You think walking away makes it easier?" Her eyes softened. "For both of us, yes." The silence between them thickened. The storm outside grew louder, wind slapping against the windows. Ethan moved closer until they were only a breath apart. "You saved me from myself, Sophie. You made me believe I could be something more than a headline." She blinked, her voice trembling slightly. "And you made me remember that I deserve to be seen. But if I stay, it will ruin both of us." He searched her face for a trace of hesitation, but she had already made her decision. "You really mean to leave?" "I do." He stepped back, defeated. Then at least answer one question. She nodded. Was any of it real for you? Her answer came after a long pause. Every moment. That is why I have to go. When she left, the door closed with a soft click that felt final. Ethan stood frozen, watching her reflection fade in the glass. The rain blurred everything beyond it. That night, he did not go home. His driver offered to wait, but he refused. He walked through the city streets, the rain soaking through his coat. No chauffeur, no driver, no plan, just a man stripped of the armor he had spent years building. He passed by the same cafe where he had once seen her laughing with the staff, her smile lighting the room. Now the windows were empty, and he was the ghost outside. By morning, he returned to his penthouse, drenched and exhausted. On the table lay an envelope sealed with her handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was her copy of the marriage contract, the edges slightly worn. Across the top, she had written a single line in blue ink. You never had to love me, but I did. Ethan sank into the nearest chair, the words burning through every defense he had left. The city was still dark beyond the glass, rain trailing down like tears he refused to shed. He pressed the paper to his chest and whispered, "What have I done?" For a man who had always believed love was a liability, he now understood the cruel irony he had spent his entire life protecting his fortune, only to lose the one thing that could not be bought. Outside, the storm began to fade, but the emptiness it left behind would not. 2 days after Sophie left, the office felt like a hollow shell of itself. Her desk stood empty, her chair pushed neatly under the table as if she might return at any moment. But she did not. The silence that followed her absence was heavier than the storm that had broken over the city days before. Ethan Hale buried himself in work, reviewing contracts, signing documents, attending meetings, and yet everything felt mechanical. The world he had built, perfect, controlled, unshakable, had suddenly lost its meaning. Every success now echoed with the same question. What was the point if she was not there to witness it? One morning, his assistant Mark entered the office holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." Ethan glanced up, impatient. "What is it?" Mark turned the screen toward him. A headline flashed across the finance newsfeed. Insider leaks suggest internal sabotage at Hale Corporation. Beneath it was a photo of Sophie walking out of the building 2 nights before. The caption read, "Former assistant linked to contract leak scandal." Ethan froze. "Who published this?" "Lucas Green," Mark said quietly. "The vice president. He told reporters she was the source." Ethan's eyes hardened. Lucas, the man who had been waiting for years to take over his seat. "Get legal on the line," Ethan ordered. "Now." Within hours, he had the proof. Security footage showed Lucas entering Ethan's office after hours, copying confidential files and planting them under Sophie's credentials. The betrayal was calculated. Lucas wanted the board to believe Sophie had sold corporate data and walked away with a payoff. When the truth sank in, Ethan felt something inside him break. Not because his company had been attacked, but because Sophie had walked away believing he would never defend her. That evening, he called an emergency board meeting. Cameras filled the room. Reporters crowded outside. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his voice steady but cold. "The accusations against Sophie Tran are false. The evidence you were given was fabricated by Lucas Green." Gasps filled the room. Lucas tried to speak, but Ethan's tone cut through. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Legal will handle the rest." When it was over, Ethan stepped out into the hall. The flashing cameras followed him, questions shouted in every direction. "Mr. Hale, will you comment on your wife's involvement?" He stopped, facing the press for the first time without armor. "She is not my assistant," he said. "She is my wife, and the only person who ever told me the truth." The flash of bulbs blurred together, but Ethan no longer cared. He had built an empire out of logic, yet it was a woman's kindness that had saved his integrity. That night, he stood by the window of his office, the city glowing beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt something that was not power or fear. It was clarity. He whispered into the empty room, "Sophie, I will find you." And this time, I will not let you go. A week later, the storm inside Ethan Hale had not settled, but his purpose had. The lies had been cleared, the board stabilized, and Lucas Green was under investigation. Yet none of it mattered without Sophie Tran. Clearing her name publicly was not enough. He needed to tell her himself. He found her through a charity registry, the same one she had helped manage months ago. It listed a new branch opening in Brooklyn, a small community center designed to help women start over. When Ethan arrived, the building was modest, nothing like the marble towers he was used to, but it felt alive. Laughter drifted from inside, the sound of people rebuilding their lives. Sophie stood near the entrance, sorting donations. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair tied back, no trace of the world she had left behind. When she looked up and saw him, her hands stilled. "Ethan," she said quietly, "why are you here?" He took a slow step forward, his voice softer than she remembered. "To tell you the truth, the story they printed about you, it was all a lie. Lucas Green set you up. I proved it publicly." Her expression faltered, torn between disbelief and exhaustion. "You did not have to come here. You have cleared your company's name. That should be enough." "It is not," he said. "I did it because I owed you the truth, but I came here because I owe you more than that." She crossed her arms, guarded. "You think an apology can fix everything?" "No," he admitted, "but maybe honesty can start something better." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise outside blended with the quiet hum of the center. Ethan continued, his tone raw. "When you left, I thought it was about the contract, about pride, but it was not. It was about fear mine. I was terrified to love you because I thought it made me weak. I was wrong." Sophie's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "You built your life on control, Ethan. Love does not work like that." "I know," he said. "That is why I am here with nothing to offer but myself." She let out a breath that sounded like the release of months of held pain. "And if I say no, then I will still thank you," he said simply, "because you are the only person who ever saw the man behind the fortune." For the first time, her expression broke. The walls she had built began to tremble. "You really are impossible," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "So, I have been told." Sophie looked away, then back at him. "You did not have to find me." "I did," Ethan said, "because what we had may have started as a contract, but it became the only thing real in my life." She held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. And though she said nothing, the way her shoulders softened told him she had already forgiven him at least partly. Outside, the rain that had followed them for weeks finally began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Hale allowed himself to hope. 3 months later, spring returned to New York, bringing color back to a city that had lived too long under gray skies. The Hale Foundation had just launched a new initiative, the Sophie Project, a scholarship and mentorship program for women rebuilding their lives. It bore her name, though she had not known until that morning. When Sophie arrived at the grand opening, she paused outside the glass doors, staring at the banner above the stage. "Empowerment begins with kindness." Her words she had once said to Ethan during one of their earliest meetings. For a moment, her throat tightened. Inside, the room buzzed with applause as Ethan Hale took the microphone. He looked different now, still composed, still sharp, but there was warmth behind his calm. "This foundation," he said, "is not about money or reputation. It is about gratitude. It is about one person who reminded me that integrity has more value than power. Her name is Sophie Tran." The audience turned as Sophie stepped forward, unsure if she should stay or run. Ethan smiled softly, setting the microphone aside. "You once told me love was not meant to be a transaction," he said. "You were right, but I would still like to renegotiate one clause from our old contract." A ripple of laughter filled the room. Sophie shook her head, both embarrassed and moved. "You never give up, do you?" "Not when the return is worth the risk," Ethan replied, stepping closer. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a familiar piece of paper, creased, fragile, the contract they had once signed. Across the top in his handwriting, he had written a single note, Clause 3, No love, no attachment. Cancelled. He looked at her, voice steady. I thought marriage was protection. I was wrong. It is a promise, and if you will let me, I would like to make it for real this time. The room fell silent. Sophie stared at him, tears catching in her lashes. You really are terrible at giving up control, she whispered. Only when it comes to you, he said. Ethan reached into his pocket and held out the same silver ring she had once dropped on the office floor. It gleamed faintly under the lights. This was a symbol of a deal once, he said. Now it is a promise of something true. Sophie hesitated, then took the ring, her fingers trembling. You never did play by the rules, Mr. Hale. He smiled, the first unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. That is because you taught me new ones. The audience erupted in applause as she nodded, slipping the ring back onto her hand. It was not grand, not rehearsed, but it was real. Two people who had begun as a business arrangement and ended as a choice. Ethan turned toward the crowd, his arm around her shoulder. She was never my risk, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. She was my return. The applause rose again, echoing through the room as light poured through the tall windows. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Hale did not measure his worth in power or money, but in the quiet, steady heartbeat of the woman who had taught him how to love. And somewhere between power and kindness, Ethan Hale finally found himself.